Most books about evolution ask you to admire the surface of life, the animal, the species, the fossil, the branching tree. The selfish gene does something far more disruptive. It asks you to step below the level of the creature you can see and place the spotlight on something smaller, colder, and more persistent. Richard Dawkins' great reframing is that the deepest drama of evolution is not centered on wolves, birds, or human beings as such. It is centered on genes, on inherited units of information that outlast individual bodies by using those bodies to get copied into the future. Once you let that idea in, ordinary life starts to look different. Conflict looks different. Love looks different. Parenting looks different. Even culture begins to look different. That is why this book still matters. It does not merely present facts about evolution. It changes the level at which the story is told, and when the level changes, the meaning of everything above it shifts as well. If you want more summaries that turn big books into clear, listenable insight and help keep your self-development moving, support the channel early by liking, sharing, and commenting on this video. That small action is what keeps these expert summaries coming and helps serious viewers find them. The title is meant to provoke, but the provocation can easily be misunderstood. Dawkins is not saying genes have consciousness, desires, or moral intent. He is not telling people that selfishness is noble, wise, or inevitable in everyday life. He is using the word selfish as a shorthand for a specific evolutionary logic. Whatever hereditary variant tends to leave more successful copies of itself will become more common over time. That is the core engine. Natural selection does not reward what is fair, emotionally pleasing, or spiritually impressive. It rewards what persists through replication. And once that becomes the main lens, the book's opening question hits with much greater force. Why are people, animals, and bodies here at all? Why are organisms built the way they are? Dawkins's answer is that organisms are not the ultimate point of the process. They are vehicles. They are temporary survival machines, assembled, modified, and filtered by successful replicators. That is the turn that gives the book its power. It takes us away from the flattering assumption that evolution is mainly about the flourishing of the individual or the good of the species, and replaces it with a tougher, more analytical way of seeing. It also makes the opening chapters feel almost like an X-ray of ordinary thinking. Species, groups, and even persons stop being the unquestioned heroes of the story. They become levels that must themselves be explained. If that idea clicks for you already, leave a short comment that says, "I see the pattern." It fits this book perfectly, because the whole experience of reading it is learning to see the hidden pattern beneath the obvious story. The book then travels backward to the earliest stages of life and asks a foundational question. What had to exist before Darwinian evolution, in any full sense, could even begin? Dawkins's answer is the replicator. Before there could be eyes, wings, nervous systems, parental care, or social behavior, there had to be entities capable of making copies of themselves, in a world where not every copy would survive equally well. The important properties of such early replicators are not beauty or consciousness. They are durability, fecundity, and fidelity. The more a replicator lasts, the more copies it produces, and the more accurate those copies are, the better its long-term prospects. Once many replicators exist in a limited environment, selection is already there in embryo. Some lines spread. Others disappear. Dawkins uses this early argument to push the reader toward a radically depersonalized view of life. Life is not first a theater of noble individuals. It is first a competition among copying patterns. From there comes one of the most haunting ideas in the book. Bodies are temporary, but genes, understood as lines of copied information, can persist over immense stretches of time. Your body feels central because you inhabit it from the inside. Evolution, in this framework, does not grant that feeling any special status. What matters is whether hereditary information successfully travels onward. That contrast between our short lives and the comparative continuity of genes gives the early chapters their strange emotional force. The book shrinks the individual without making life trivial. Instead, it relocates significance. We are not the final unit of the story. We are transient carriers in a much longer chain. That is not meant as an insult to human importance. It is meant as a correction to biological storytelling. Once Dawkins has established that correction, he can reinterpret behavior at every higher level through the fate of the replicators underneath. That leads directly into the book's next decisive move, redefining the organism itself. A living creature becomes, in Dawkins's language, a survival machine. Brains, limbs, hormones, instincts, appetites, and patterns of response are all parts of a design shaped by long selection for replicative success. We normally describe an animal in terms of what it wants. It seeks food, avoids danger, attracts mates, protects young, and navigates its surroundings. The gene's eye view does not deny those immediate realities, but it asks why such machinery exists in the first place and why it is organized in those particular ways. The answer is that bodies are the means by which genes navigate the world. If a certain form of perception, aggression, attachment, fear, timing, or social response tends to improve the odds that those genes will be passed on, then over many generations, that design is more likely to remain. Dawkins is also careful in the deeper logic of the book that this is metaphorical language. Genes do not literally scheme, but selection can produce outcomes that look strategic because unsuccessful designs were filtered out. That clarification is essential before the book enters the messier territory of social life. That logic is first tested in the book's treatment of aggression. Dawkins pushes back against the idea that animal conflict should be understood as either noble heroism or savage bloodlust. Instead, he frames aggression as strategy under selective pressure. Fighting has costs. Injury is costly. Death is costly. Even a winner can lose precious energy or future reproductive potential. So the real question is not whether organisms are naturally violent or naturally peaceful. The real question is what behavioral patterns are favored in particular competitive settings. This is where the book draws on evolutionarily stable strategies to show that success depends not only on what one individual does, but on what others in the population are doing as well. In one environment, reckless escalation may fail. In another, display, territorial ritual, or limited contest may work better. Apparent restraint need not be moral. It can simply be a superior strategic equilibrium. This chapter matters because it destroys the lazy assumption that stable forms of order in nature must exist for the good of the species. Dawkins's counter-argument is that many such patterns can arise because genes that avoid wasteful losses outcompete genes that drive bodies into doomed fights. Nature, in this picture, is neither morally gentle nor purely brutal. It is strategic. From aggression, the book moves into a more subtle world of maneuver, manipulation, and strategic play. Not every evolutionary success comes from overpowering a rival directly. Sometimes, success comes from timing, bluff, deception, exploitation, or influencing the choices of another organism in ways that favor one's own reproductive line. The larger point Dawkins is building is that the selfish gene can express itself through highly indirect means. Selection is not committed to straight lines or moral transparency. It is committed to results. If a circuitous route through manipulation produces more copies, that route can be favored just as surely as open force. This helps explain why the natural world so often looks like an uneasy mix of order and trickery. Organisms move through a world of rivals, mates, relatives, parasites, allies, and competitors, whose interests overlap only partially. In such a world, pressure builds not just for strength, but for leverage. Dawkins's achievement here is not that he makes life seem cruel. It is that he makes apparently odd behavior interpretable once you stop expecting nature to be morally coherent at the level of the individual organism. The next major turn is reproduction and parental investment in the section Dawkins frames through family planning. Here he asks a question that seems simple until you really sit with it. Why should an organism not produce as many offspring as possible? Why would limitation ever be favored? The gene-centered answer is that more is not always better. Offspring are not free. They cost time, energy, nourishment, attention, and opportunity. Resources spent on one young organism cannot be spent somewhere else. A parent that produces too many offspring may reduce the survival chances of them all, or damage its own future reproductive prospects. So, selection can favor patterns that optimize long-term gene propagation under real constraints, rather than maximize the raw number of births or eggs in a single burst. This is one of the book's most important recurring moves. Dawkins takes a phenomenon that people often explain with vague appeals to natural balance or species wisdom and rebuilds it in terms of trade-offs. Bodies become economic systems from the perspective of replication. Care, effort, energy, and risk all have opportunity costs. A central reason Dawkins needs this machinery is to handle one of evolution's most famous puzzles. Why do organisms ever seem to sacrifice for others? Why does a bird give an alarm call? Why does an insect worker forego direct reproduction? Why does a parent risk so much? Dawkins's answer is that altruism at the level of the organism can still be fully consistent with selfishness at the level of the gene. A gene can increase its own representation not only through the body it sits in, but through other bodies likely to carry copies of it as well. That is why relatedness matters so much in the overall architecture of the book. Helping relatives is not a magical exception to selection. It can be one of selection's most effective routes. In that sense, the apparent contradiction begins to dissolve. A body can lose. A lineage of genes can still win. This is one of the reasons the book had such impact. It took behaviors often wrapped in vague appeals to species welfare and grounded them in the sharper logic of kin selection and inclusive fitness. That is the force of the chapter on the conflict between generations. Family is where people most expect unity. Dawkins does not deny the reality of care. Instead, he asks what kind of conflict can exist inside care itself. A parent is related to each child, but not in exactly the same way the child is related to itself. A child is, from its own genetic standpoint, a more urgent project than a sibling is. A parent, by contrast, is selected to distribute investment across current and possible future offspring in a way that best serves total reproductive success. So the family is not a zone without tension. It is a zone of partial alignment. Children can be selected to demand more than is ideal for the parent to give. Parents can be selected to resist demands that threaten broader reproductive prospects. Siblings can be allies and competitors at the same time. This chapter is powerful because it reveals a pattern that runs through the whole book. Conflict is often built into cooperation, not opposed to it from the outside. If this section is making you notice how often the surface story hides a deeper one, drop another short comment. I look deeper. From parent-child tension, the book broadens into one of its most famous and most controversial territories, the battle between the sexes. Here, Dawkins emphasizes asymmetry. Eggs and sperm are not equivalent investments. Gestation, bodily cost, parental care, certainty, and risk can differ sharply between males and females in many species. Those asymmetries create different selective pressures, and different pressures tend to generate different behavioral strategies. Sexual life becomes, in this framework, a field of bargaining, attraction, competition, withholding, commitment, desertion, and strategic timing. Males and females are not natural enemies in an absolute sense, but neither are they guaranteed to want exactly the same outcome from every reproductive encounter. This is one reason the chapter remains so vivid. It strips away romantic simplification without collapsing into total cynicism. Courtship and pair bonding are not dismissed as illusions. They are reinterpreted as phenomena shaped by different reproductive interests that sometimes converge and sometimes pull apart. The book works best when readers remember that this is a biological framework, not a complete explanation of human emotional life. But as a framework, it is bracingly powerful. At this point, a reader might start to suspect that the whole book is heading toward a bleak conclusion. If genes are selfish, will every apparent kindness dissolve into disguised advantage? Dawkins turns hard against that misunderstanding in his discussion of reciprocal altruism. This chapter is one of the hinges of the entire work because it shows how a gene-centered view can explain real cooperation beyond close kinship. Helping another organism can be favored if that help increases the chance of return help later, or if repeated interaction makes mutual assistance more profitable than isolated defection. But such cooperation does not evolve in a vacuum. Conditions matter. Repeated encounters, some ability to recognize individuals, some way to detect or punish cheats, and a payoff structure in which long-term reciprocity beats short-term treachery. The insight is bigger than biology. Dawkins is showing that selfish underlying logic does not force selfish surface behavior. Under the right structure of incentives, generosity, warning, alliance, and mutual support can be stable. That replaces a childish opposition between goodness and self-interest with a more mature understanding of how the two can become entangled. Around here, if this summary is helping you unpack a difficult classic clearly, take a second to like, share, and comment. Support works here much like cooperation in the book itself. Many small acts keep something worthwhile alive. Then comes the book's boldest expansion. After spending so much time teaching the reader to think in terms of replicators, Dawkins asks, what happens if genes are not the only replicators that matter? What if culture, too, contains units that spread by being copied? This is where he introduces the idea of memes. A tune, a phrase, a ritual, a slogan, a belief, a method, a fashion, a doctrine, even a habit of mind can move from person to person if it is good at being imitated and retained. The analogy to genes is not perfect, and the chapter is more speculative than the earlier biological chapters. But that is part of what makes it so influential. Dawkins is generalizing the logic of replication. He is asking readers to imagine culture as another competitive arena in which some patterns survive because they are catchy, memorable, institutionally reinforced, emotionally sticky, or otherwise good at reproducing themselves through minds. Whether or not one accepts every implication of memetics, the role of this chapter inside the book is crucial. It belongs exactly here. First, Dawkins trains the reader to think at the level of replicators in biology. Then he asks whether that style of explanation might travel beyond biology. After that leap outward, Dawkins returns to cooperation with sharper tools in the later added discussion, often remembered through the phrase, "nice guys finish first." Here he moves from broad reciprocity to more explicit game-theoretic thinking. In repeated interactions, a strategy that begins cooperatively, retaliates against betrayal, and returns to cooperation when the other side does, can outperform both blind innocence and non-stop nastiness. The lesson is elegant and deeply important. In a world where encounters are not one-off events, relentless exploitation is not always the winner. Conditional cooperation can be astonishingly robust. This is where the book corrects the shallow reader who thinks the title settles everything. The title gives the engine. These later chapters give the consequences, and the consequences are subtler than slogans. Selection can favor alliances, pair bonding, warning signals, mutual help, and civil restraint, not because nature has transcended competition, but because competition itself may reward a stable cooperative strategy under the right conditions. If you have stayed with this summary to this point, you are exactly the kind of viewer who helps build a thoughtful audience around serious books. Share this video with one person who likes big ideas. And if you want a short phrase for this chapter, comment, "Cooperation can win." The final movement of the book widens the lens one more time. If genes are the relevant units for understanding selection, then their effects are not neatly confined to the skin of the organism carrying them. Their influence can extend outward through behavior, into the environment, into the treatment of relatives, into social organization, and into the altered conditions other organisms must live in. A gene's reach, in this sense, is measured by its causal impact on future replication, rather than by anatomy alone. That is why the book never stays down at the level of molecules for long. It keeps returning to behavior, because behavior is one of the main ways genes shape the world that future genes must enter. The organism is not just a container. It is an instrument whose actions can transform the success landscape. But the deepest human point arrives at the end, and it is the correction many casual readers miss. Dawkins does not close by saying that once we understand genetic selfishness, we should bow to it. He argues the opposite. Understanding the machinery gives us some chance of resisting it. Human beings can reflect. We can examine impulses, institutions, inherited tendencies, and contagious ideas rather than simply enact them. Explanation is not endorsement. To uncover the selective roots of rivalry or manipulation is not to declare those roots morally binding. That is also why the book continues to attract both admiration and criticism. Its metaphors are vivid enough to transform public understanding, but vivid metaphors always risk being taken too literally. Selfish gene is brilliant because it makes the unit of selection unforgettable. It is controversial for the same reason. A fair reading has to resist both simplifications, the claim that the book is cold determinism and the claim that it is merely a catchy slogan. It is neither. It is a serious attempt to rethink evolution from the level of the replicator upward. So, what does the selfish gene finally leave behind in the reader? Not a moral system. Not a sentimental consolation. It leaves behind a habit of thought. It teaches you to stop treating the visible level of behavior as the final explanation, and to ask what pattern of replication lies underneath. It explains why apparent altruism can arise from deeper self-propagating logic, why conflict appears inside cooperation, why families are loving and tense at the same time, why sexual life often mixes coordination with struggle, why kindness can be strategically stable, and why culture may itself operate through replicating units that spread for reasons of copyability rather than truth. Along the way, the book also demonstrates the enormous power of scientific metaphor. Terms like selfish gene and survival machine are vivid enough to reorganize how people think, which is one reason the book has been so influential and so debated. Its lasting power comes from the fact that it does not just offer answers. It changes the questions. Instead of asking whether a trait helps the species, it asks what hereditary pattern it helps propagate. Instead of assuming that cooperation disproves competition, it asks whether competition sometimes favors cooperation. Instead of taking the individual organism as the unquestioned center, it asks whether the organism is better understood as a vehicle built by something more enduring. And instead of treating culture as a separate human realm, it asks whether ideas themselves can compete for survival. If this summary helped you see the book more clearly, please like, share, and comment one final time. It genuinely helps this series continue. See you in the next summary.